I know it's a cliche that people talk about falling into payroll, but mine was absolutely not by design. I'm a software developer. That's what I love to do. It's what I've always done. The answer to be for an HR system. And I think the answer for me is people. You're doing it for people. There are people behind it. None of us go to work for free. The minimum requirement is that we get paid and we get paid correctly.
Here's a pre-show scenario for you. Imagine you had to visit 6 houses just to cook your dinner. One place has the pots and pans, one has the stove, another has the food. You get the idea. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, the reality is most global businesses operate the same way, using 6 different tools just to pay their global workforce. But now there's one platform offering truly simple, truly global payroll, and that's today's sponsor, Deel. That's Deel. With in-house customer success managers, local payroll experts, dedicated points of contact, and more, Deel eliminates third-party handovers and provides unmatched compliance and flexibility. In fact, they'll even help you track and flag the latest changes to payroll regulations before they even become an issue. So are you ready to transform your global payroll system? If you are, click the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deel today. That's Deel. Hello and welcome back to the Payroll Podcast. My name is Nick Day. I'm CEO at JGA Recruitment Group, and we are specialist payroll recruiters. Now, if you are new to this show, please do remember to click on subscribe so you never miss a future episode. If you're working in payroll and enjoy the show, please, if you can, remember to share it with all of your payroll colleagues and friends as well, so we can really raise the profile of payroll for everyone that tunes in. And last but by no means least, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could leave us a review if you enjoyed today's content or the content of previous shows as well. Now, today, I have a huge privilege of speaking with Jason Sweby, a veteran in payroll software development. He's got over 25 years experience and deep involvement in legislative transformations. And his insights today are going to enlighten all of you into the evolution of payroll systems, how they've coincided with the evolution of payroll legislation as well, and how that's going to impact the future of payroll compliance. So lots to dive into today. For those not familiar, he has played a pivotal role in advancing payroll and HR software solutions. And he's did that by starting his career by joining his father's business, Carval Computing, where he not only rewrote the company's primary product for the Windows platform, but later as technical director and co-owner, led its acquisition and transition to the cloud with Civica. Recently, Jason returned to his first love, which is software development, which is focusing on legislative changes in payroll and HR, bringing a wealth of all of his knowledge and all of his years of experience about government compliance, payroll compliance, and software into his new world of work. So we're going to talk about that as well on today's show. So without further ado, welcome, Jason, to the Payroll Podcast. How are you feeling?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yeah, nice to talk to you. And yeah, it's funny to hear your life distilled back like that in a few short minutes.
Yeah, no, it's always quite fun pulling it together, and you suddenly realise just how much impact and how much experience people have got. Right? It's quite incredible, and you've been on an incredible journey yourself. And I'm really keen to bring that to life for our listeners. Before we dive into that, though, let me ask you my first question, which is this: what does the word payroll mean to you?
Payroll, for me, I think my answer ties in with what you would imagine the answer to be for an HR system, and I think the answer for me is people. I think it's easy to forget once you're knee deep in legislation and compliance and all the things that you have to do, that you're doing it for people. There are people behind it. None of us go to work for free. The minimum requirement is that we get paid and we get paid correctly. And so many payroll systems these days are written hand in hand with an HR system, or at least are heavily integrated with one. Ours is no different. And yeah, for me, payroll is all about people.
Fantastic. I mean, on the surface, that sounds really simple, right? That's a really great way to start the show. You've already managed to integrate the kind of word systems into that response as well. We're going to dive into a bit of that. Of course, under the hood, it's a lot more complex, whether you are manually processing payroll or whether, of course, you're developing the systems that support people to process payroll. So before we jump into how that all works, I wonder if you can just, I know I've given a bit of an introduction, but just bring your career to life a little bit for the listeners. Maybe add in some of the gaps that maybe I missed, because you came into payroll in a slightly different direction to others because you joined your father's company. And I'd just love to know a little bit more about your own evolution, really.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. I know it's a cliche that people talk about falling into payroll, but mine was absolutely not by design. I'm a software developer. That's what I love to do. It's what I've always done. And the first jobs I had nothing to do with payroll or HR or anything like that. But yeah, as you said, my dad had a business that he sort of had started in the 1980s that was doing payroll and HR and time and attendance as well. And late 90s, as sort of the emergence of Windows was sort of coming back into fashion, and I was brought in to sort of rewrite the products for the Windows code base, and allow us to target whole new markets that were out there looking for desktop systems. So at that point, it was very much, I didn't understand payroll. It was basically taking an existing system and rewriting it, not really understanding the mechanics of how payroll worked, just sort of working through the calculations and rewriting the code. But over the years, and my dad has a lot of should take a lot of credit for this, for his patience. He'd sit with me and we would work through the payroll calculation so that I understood it at a payroll level as well as at a technical level. And that was a huge game changer for me, because it meant that once he started to step away from the business, I was in a position that I could carry on all that legislative work. As we're getting compliance changes in through HMRC, etc., I was able to visualize where I need to make the changes in the software to deal with that. So that really is sort of my journey of how I came into payroll. And like I said, we also do HR and time and attendance as well, but there's less compliance around those. I mean, there's more compliance in
Sure.
HR now than there used to be, but it's not about getting a right answer like payroll is. Ultimately, it's about coming down to the right answer. And so really, yeah, my sort of journey led me into going through legislation, pouring through legislation, and not just from HMRC. Anybody listening to this podcast will know that it's coming in from all sides, whether it's coming in from the pension regulator, teachers' pensions, depending on your sector, the sort of the gender pay gap legislation, anything like that. It's coming in from all sides. And I've found out that I actually quite enjoy taking those words, that guidance, and turning it into code that people can then use to make their job easier. Because if anyone that's ever had to work with the gender pay gap, for example, will know it's an absolute minefield, and that the legislation and the guidance is very woolly by design, which makes it pretty impossible for software developers to come up with the right answer, but we can come up with a 95% right answer, and the guidance allows for that kind of level of deviation. But with tax and national insurance and student loans and attachment of earnings orders and those sorts of things, they have to be accurate to the penny. Statutory pay, is another one. All these things have to be accurate to the penny, and I actually get a bit of a kick out of sort of that legislation coming in and working out how I'm going to turn that into software that so that people then who are buying the software don't have to worry about it. And of course, it's not just me. There are hundreds of other payroll software products out there, and other people like me who've led those products or worked on them, at a lower level, and they're all doing the same. It's not me doing anything particularly magic on my own. This sort of thing is happening all over the place. But it's just an interesting insight, I think, to people who use payroll software. Maybe it's just sort of lifts the lid a little bit, just to sort of show that there's an awful lot of work that goes on under the hood to make it happen, to bring you that compliant software in the first place. And it's not
Yeah.
like the old days where you used to get one set of updates by HMRC at the end of the year. They're drifting in, during the year now, and especially, I know recent guests on your podcast have talked about it, but in the last couple of years, we've obviously had mid-year national insurance changes, and the way they've been handled have all been slightly different to the way that they were handled in previous years. So that it's not just a rate change now, it also affects the software a little bit, because some of them were employer only, some of them were employee and employer national insurance. So it's just little nuances like that we have to take into account, and we have to really make sure that we're checking the detail, so that by the time it gets to the end user, it's accurate and correct.
It seems to me either you're a natural payroller at heart, Jason, or your dad's influence has rubbed off on you. But the way that you talk about the industry, the getting the everything correct right down to the penny, making sure that you're always up to speed with legislation. I understand it's part of your career, right? But actually, it's managed to keep your attention for 25 years. And I think one thing that's quite interesting in the way that you talk about the industry is, I work as a talent specialist, acquisition specialist, trying to find talent for different businesses. And when we're tasked with the role of finding a payroll software developer, actually that's one of the most challenging roles that we have to fill, because trying to convince developers who are working in, on the face of it, more attractive sectors, should we say more creative sectors, trying to get them to come into the payroll sector can sometimes be quite a challenge. And as passionate as I am, and anyone that comes onto this show or listens to this show will know how passionate we all are about the world of payroll, convincing someone that's never been in that industry to take that risk, to take that jump over, to realize what it has to offer, can sometimes be quite challenging for us as recruiters to try and convince that actually this is a worthwhile profession. It's a growing profession. There's loads of opportunity. You're fully immersed in all these new tools and tech and fast changing, all these kind of things that you mentioned, especially now with legislation changing at any one time. What would you say has been if you're working in my shoes, what would be the way that you would sell it from a developer perspective as to why payroll is such an interesting, challenging, and I guess valuable profession in terms of the fact that you've obviously created a really good career on the back of it?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think most software developers are problem solvers, and that's where I think payroll particularly provides a lot of ammunition. A colleague of mine recently said, we were sort of going through a particularly challenging time of a lot of work to do, and he said, yeah, but it's all problem solving, it's all code at the end of the day, it can all be done. And I think payroll is constantly changing. Yes, it can be glacial at times. I think that it seems to be changing quite a lot at the moment, but there was a sort of a good 6 or 7 year period where things were fairly static. But things are sort of moving along again at a good pace. So there's always changes, there's always things to do, so there's always problems to solve. So as a software developer, that's what you want. You want those problems to solve. You don't want to just be standing still. And I think where you sort of alluded to this, that I've kind of sort of grown passionate about doing that probably wasn't true at the beginning. I sort of thought, that period towards the end of a year where I'm working on the legislative changes ahead of the next April always used to be a bit of a burden. I used to think, I've got to get that done, and then I can get back to the fun stuff of enhancing the product generally, and putting nice new features in. But over the years, I've actually come to actually really appreciate that period of the year where I'm going through the legislation. And that, we have a team now that they get to work on the new enhancements and moving the product forward, making it more modern, more technically interesting. And I'm happy with my place now in dealing with all the legislative changes. And it's now not just the UK as well, because we deal with Republic of Ireland and the Crown dependencies, so Jersey, Guernsey, and Isle of Man. That's 2 different tax years that we have to deal with now, because some of them are working January to December, some of them are working April to March. So actually we have sort of 2 year ends that we're always dealing with now. So we've sort of widened the scope of what we offer, which means that we've widened the amount of legislation that we have to keep on top of as well.
Sure.
So it's that sort of thing to sort of go back to your original question, which is it's always moving and it's always interesting, and ultimately that's what developers like to do.
Something I'm keen to have, probably the first opportunity I've got to really ask this question. Certainly, I've raised it as something to be wary of from the way that I'm seeing the market, and but this is purely based on the number of approaches I get from guests to be on the show and from different people trying to sort of peddle wares or whatever. Now, obviously, you've got a 25-year track record, a solid track record as a service provider in the industry, where you've gained significant expertise and experience over time to understand what changes mean and how they impact and how to do the calculations. And okay, we don't know what's coming around the corner, but we already have an ingrained sense of understanding of how that may impact on a broader scale if something was to shift. And I know that obviously you've worked, we'll get into that in a minute, extensively in terms of sort of HMRC compliance as well, and that's, we'll get into that a little bit later on. My question, though, is we're in the the world of AI now. We're in a world of huge investment where payroll seems to be the department that's ripe for change. And I've seen more solution providers come into the market than I've ever seen before, some of which I can't actually see any track record in the space. That doesn't mean to say their product isn't great, but it would leave me with some potential concerns as a potential client to say, well, okay, the system sounds amazing, but what's your track record? You've never worked in payroll. You've always been in a slightly different space. It's your first kind of step in. And of course, that they are going to be disrupting the traditional providers out there that have been doing this for many, many years. I guess I'm trying to formulate a question here. I think I have some concern about the number of providers coming in. I'd be keen to understand from a software development side of things, who's been entrenched and immersed in this industry for so long, what do you think are the risks and potentially the opportunities for providers in this space at the moment with the emergence of things like AI and with the, I guess, the ability to create a payroll solution much quicker now than potentially, even with open code and things like that, than ever before? What should the clients listening to this, the people listening to this that may be considering a new solution, that are getting emails every day about the bells and whistles that this solution might provide, really need to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Of course, we're all touting our wares, and there's. It's interesting you say that there is a growing number of providers, and for years I thought that it felt like it was shrinking because there were acquisitions like ours and
Sure.
other businesses that we were continually sort of competing with, also being acquired or being the acquirer. But yes, there does seem to be potentially more in the space. I think my advice to people looking for a payroll product, and I hope people understand that I'm not here to tout my wares. I've not named the company I work for. I'm not here to it's not about that. It's really to talk about sort of the software side of payroll, and for people to sort of understand how that works. I think ultimately, you said it's track record. It's talking to those providers, as and I know the tender processes can be very long, so I know everyone does their due diligence properly these days. But you do have to look under the hood and see what experience does that business have. It's not just the product that you get demoed on the day, but what's the relationship going to be like with your account manager? What kind of level of payroll consultancy is there available within the business? And also, the development team as well. I'm in a slightly unique position, I guess, that because I ran Carval for a number of years, I ran the payroll for many, many years. And that means that I'm sort of coming at payroll software development with a unique insight, as I was also a payroller. I don't do it for Civica now, but I did do it for Carval for a long time. And that gave me the opportunity to actually look at our own software and acknowledge some of the pain points that I was dealing with on a monthly basis when I was running our payroll. And so I adapted the software a little bit to overcome some of the hassles and sort of bumps that I was finding. And ultimately, everybody then gets to benefit from that, because I'm even if they're low level fixes, small quality of life improvements, they're sort of little quick wins that everybody can benefit from. And it's that sort of experience that you can't buy. You can't shortcut that. With AI, I'm a real skeptic. Maybe I'm just because I'm slightly older and I've been in the payroll software development business for a long time. And AI feels like a bit of an upstart, but from what I've seen of it at the moment, it feels quite gimmicky. I know that the business that Civica I work with now, that's sort of exploring the idea of using it alongside software development rather than instead of. I think it's very much an alongside tool, where it can recommend and make changes, and maybe it can write a quick function for you. But I did experiment with it in the early days, and I asked it to write a very quick tax calculation, based on UK tax. And I was reasonably impressed that it had actually gone away, found out the current tax rates, and written a routine in a language of my choice that would calculate tax. But it only did it at 20%. It didn't take into account the tax rates and the tax bands and all the little quirks, the free pay. So it has a use. I can see it will continue to grow. But at the minute, AI, to me, like I said, I'm skeptical about it. I think it's in its infancy, and I'm fascinated to see where it goes. Don't get me wrong. I'm a software developer. I think it's fascinating, but it's not something that I currently feel is a threat. As for disruptors in the business, I mean, we were that once, so I welcome disruption, I welcome competition because it pushes us all to be better, to work harder, to find an angle, to find what makes us stand out. And as you've said, there are plenty of payroll software products on the market, and we're all looking for that element that makes us stand out. And I would argue there's no perfect product on the market. I think we all have our place, and we all know what our strengths and weaknesses are. So those disruptors are there, to push us harder. But ultimately, I think to your question, the lack of track record would certainly be a concern for me if I was a consumer looking for a new product.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting response. I enjoyed your response in relation to the tax calculation, because 20%, and I can understand that probably did come back about 20% accurate. And what's interesting there, for those that are concerned about AI, whether you're a software developer or working for a software provider, or whether you're working on a transactional side of things, you still need that, particularly because there's so much nuance in payroll. You still need that human skill to contextualize it, to understand it. The tax calculation, say, is that influenced by Freeports, is influenced by something else, and I think that's what's quite exciting, that we can definitely use AI and leverage it to support the work we're doing, but it needs a careful eye, a watchful eye of expertise to make sure that it's doing things in the right order. And I would probably agree with you as well that at the moment we are probably in a bit of a gimmicky stage. I think that's why I mentioned the bells and whistles. I get pitched them all the time in recruitment. We could do this for this, and we can have avatars meet all your candidates. And I'm like, why would I want that? Like, I don't know how that's helpful. It looks great until you realize it has no real business case. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in our space at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's a real crossover as well that people need to understand. There's a difference between machine learning and AI, but everything is called AI because no one knows what machine learning is, and nobody wants to know. That sounds even more dull. But actually, most things I think that are being touted as AI are really just very, very clever procedural programming rather than AI, which is genuinely learning, and that's a whole different beast. And I don't, like I said, I remain skeptical. I also am happy to be proven wrong,
Sure.
but at the minute, it's not something that I feel is a threat to anybody.
So something's really interesting. You mentioned, and I mentioned in the introduction as well, you successfully brought your company through to an acquisition into the cloud as well, and you've been working in software development. You came into payroll. You worked then as a payroll professional as well, doing a payroll for your business. You've also got the HR expertise and time and attendance expertise because you're developing products on that side. But also, I imagine in the role that you've operated in, you've had to be an HR expert as well within your own business, and you've gone through an M&A process, so kind of had to wear lots of different hats, which I guess gives you a really rounded lens on what the industry is doing at the moment. I just would like to get a bit of an understanding of how you see the market at the moment in its current guise, and tell us a little bit about that process of going from developer at the start that didn't want to be necessarily involved in payroll right through to actually taking the journey that took you all the way through to acquisition.
So the way I see the market at the moment is that, like I said, I think it's all about people now companies finding their place. For years as Carval, we would often come down to the last 3 or 4, and it would always be against the same competitors. And it's still the same now within Civica, and it's pretty much the same competitors as well. So we're obviously all competing in the same space. And like I said, each of them are very much looking for their niche they're in. And I think I think gone are the days where payroll providers are trying to be all things to everybody. I think it is about specializing, and I don't mean specializing in very niche areas. Specializing generally. So Civica, for example, are a very local government, public sector facing. They have this whole aim to sort of be a GovTech champion. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't still interested in private sector clients. We have probably just as many as we have public sector clients. But public sector is a whole different beast to private sector, because obviously in the private sector you can choose pretty much your own. Once you've sort of done the statutory stuff, everything else is your choice. Whereas with public sector, there's a lot more bureaucracy, a lot more rules. There's green books and purple books and red books for all different industries about how to calculate sick pay and things like that. So it really is about now, just the way I see it, people are trying to find their strength and hone in on that rather than just being all things to all people. that's the way I feel it's going at the moment. In terms of the acquisition, I mean that was an interesting time, and we Carval was a small business. It was probably turning over £3-4 million a year, which was is not big compared to a lot of the big players out there. But like I said, we were competing with those bigger players when it sort of came down to the last 2 or 3 providers that customers were looking for. But ultimately, what was hurting us was that we were a small business, and that people would, if it came down to this company or this company, they would ultimately probably side with the one that was bigger, that had been not necessarily been around the longest, because Carval had been around for a long time, but really just had that sort of financial backing, and that was starting to become more and more prevalent. So one of the reasons that we sort of agreed to go through the acquisition with Civica was that they didn't already have an HR and payroll platform. They wanted to add one to their portfolio, and then they wanted to grow it from within. They didn't just want to acquire a business, acquire the customer base, and knock out the product, in favor of a competing one. And that was very appealing to us. And it meant, as an employer, it meant that people weren't going to lose their jobs just because I wanted to sort of cash in on the business. But it meant that everybody kept their jobs, everybody would continue working for the product, and we'd get to see it grow. And in fairness, to them, they did that. They've invested in the product, and it's grown and grown and grown. And it's the same product under the hood. The engine is the same, but everything around it has really grown, and it just looks and runs and feels much better than we could have ever achieved as a small business. But it was an interesting time.
Hearing your commentary on the niching side of things, or niche if you're listening in the US, on the idea that providers now are trying to focus in on a particular area or specialization or sector or vertical. Because actually we've seen the same in recruitment. I mean, when I launched JJ Recruitment, we did payroll recruitment across all payroll positions, all levels, all sectors. We still do, but we now have specific teams that focus on project and implementation roles. We have people that specifically specialize on sales positions or contract positions or senior positions. And we've had to, because I think even in the world of recruitment, the roles within payroll have actually diversified quite significantly. That, a transactional payroll administrator is significantly different in skill set to a payroll analyst, for example, who's working very much in the data and trying to create strategic insights, or, a global payroll is very different to a domestic payroll, and things like that. So we've seen that shift quite a lot. We've had to kind of adjust our own approach in recruitment to try and keep up. And it's interesting that the providers have done the same thing. You mentioned as well that you've got, and I'll to bring up to the listeners, you've got a lot of experience in working with government departments, obviously through Civica and beyond. Have you seen the relationship between government compliance requirements and payroll software evolve? Because you said it is quite different to the private sector. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it can really depend on which agency you're working with. Having worked with quite a few now over the years and in different territories. So I mentioned Republic of Ireland as well, and working with the Irish Revenue, who are very much feels many years behind where the UK are, and that's a very different relationship. So for me, the sort of top tier, most people probably wouldn't think a developer would say this, but HMRC actually have got it right. They actually work incredibly well with payroll developers. I remember going to the launch of the Making Tax Digital sort of project many years ago in the Treasury, and one of their big things was the more compliant we can help you make your software, the more tax revenue we collect as a government. So it's in their best interest to make us deliver the best product that we can. And so the relationship with HMRC has always been good, but cutbacks over the years have made that slightly harder, because they used to produce like paper booklets once a month and send them out to us with all the guidance and all the changes that were coming down the line. It's slightly harder to find that information now, but most developers will be on a mailing list with a software developer support team at HMRC, and they are very proactive at pushing information out about what's coming. So you mentioned free ports earlier. We had that information probably 6 to 9 months in advance of it being published,
Okay.
so that we
Right.
knew what was coming. And even if it was just a placeholder to say, this is coming, this is what we think it's going to look like, but don't do anything yet until we give you more specific guidance. And then that tends to come in sort of towards the end of the calendar year, so that we've then got sort of 2 or 3 months to build it into the product ready for the following April. So yeah, the revenue, sort of do a good job. We then work with, people like the pension regulator. They were very good when they introduced auto enrollment. They were very, very proactive. I remember them coming down because Carval was based in Plymouth, so lovely. It's lovely down here, but it's miles from anywhere. So when you suddenly get people like the pension regulator who are having to travel the country visiting all the payroll developers, it was a big ask for them to do that, but they did, and they came and sat with us, and we'd written auto enrollment into our payroll product, but they sat with us and sort of said, "Oh, if you could just do this, tweak it, make it a bit better, a bit more user friendly." So again, another example of an agency that sort of did a good job to reach out and make sure that those early days of auto enrollment were going well. I probably won't name other departments that don't do it quite so
No,
well,
that's fine.
but like I said earlier, there are certain areas of payroll and HR as well, I will say, where we work with the agencies to produce their compliant annual returns and things like that. And the guidance is a lot more woolly. It's harder to get hold of that information. They're not proactive. You have to go and find it. And that's where it gets harder. And that's where the experience comes in, I think, because then you know where to go, who to talk to. You build those relationships. We have a good relationship, for example, with teachers' pensions, because we've got a strong education base. So we have I have a monthly meeting with teachers' pensions to make sure that we can discuss everything that's coming, everything that's going to change, and make sure that guidance is right. So that's kind of my main answer, really, is that it very much depends on which agency you're dealing with, but
Yeah.
some of them are better than others.
No, well, it's nice to have it rebalanced. I think sometimes HMRC, probably justified, get a pretty tough press on this show from people that are struggling with, long waiting times or incorrect things and coming through. And we had Joanna Rowland back on the show a long time ago, who gave a really good insight on the Payroll Podcast about the projects actually of making tax digital and how they responded in the pandemic and things like that. So we have tried to give some balance on the show as well, having representatives on there. And I'd welcome more if anyone's listening to this and you want to come onto the show and talk about what the HMRC are doing. I'd certainly welcome them on. One thing that's quite interesting, I think you mentioned earlier, right at the start, about how in payroll it's often quite binary, right? You can't afford to make mistakes. People come to work to get paid, and we talked about what the word payroll meant, and that's why we come to work. It's the be all and end all. And if we get that wrong, we know that the impact can be quite catastrophic. I think 1 in 6 employees, was the latest research I read, said they would consider quitting their job if they were paid incorrectly even once. So we know that the significance is pretty bad, right? And we know that the impact it can have on brand reputation as well. But also, and even when you talked about AI and trying to create, a tax thing, it got it 20% right. When it comes to payroll, we need to be 100% accurate. But sometimes legislative content that's released by HMRC can be really, really challenging. And sometimes, even as the most experienced payroll professional out there, will have to try and interpret it in a particular way because they won't necessarily think the guidance is completely clear. So what are some of the challenges you face, Jason, when it comes to translating some of that really complex legislative changes that you have to deal with when you get those updates, whatever, into what is effectively a functional software update?
Yeah, I mean, in fairness to the revenue, they tend to be very prescriptive, and you do tend to get a right answer. And when you think about things like tax and national insurance, student loans, they actually they provide us with test packs, usually in sort of late January, early February each year, so that we can run our software through the test packs and make sure that our answers tie up to their answers to the penny. That's what we're looking for. So, largely with the revenue, things tend to be fairly well described. They used to be better, I will say. When we think about things like when you're calculating maternity pay and you've got your average weekly earnings calculation that's part of that, back in the sort of late 2000s, I think they produced some guidance that was almost written. I think it was written for developers, and it sort of worked through. It had variables and they'd done a really, really good job, and it made our jobs quite easy then, because we could basically just take that pseudo code, turning it into real code, and deliver a solution. We don't get that level of detail anymore. We don't get it down to that sort of developer level, and that's fine. That's our job. That's what we're paid to do. But it does sometimes, you do really have to, like you said, you have to dig into the weeds, or you have to dig into the examples that they provide, because the examples often, when there's a right answer, you almost have to retrofit the answer back into the equation, reverse engineer it to work out what they probably meant here. And ultimately, what you're always looking for is to get back to the right answer. And if the guidance was a little bit more woolly about how you got there, then you kind of need to work that out for yourself and retrofit it yourself.
That makes sense.
The worst example of trying to come up with a software solution was, I think I mentioned it earlier, was the gender pay gap. It is designed to allow for some level of employer discretion, which makes it impossible for software developers to come up with a definitive answer. All you can do is provide the tools for them to make those discretionary changes after the fact.
Was that more challenging than furlough legislation? I say that because furlough was brand new, never seen before. It came instant. We had to have an instant response. I knew I had a lot of developers. This was a good example of why human capability was important at that time, because software wasn't ready for it, hadn't predicted it, because no one knew this was going to come, and then suddenly we had to get this this new code and these new ways of calculating things. Was that, are you finding gender pay gap more complex than that? Even if you don't, how did you respond? How did you find that period of time?
Yeah, I mean, furlough was a bit of a one-off, wasn't it? That was a really unique situation, and we, again, I think this leads back to your point about track record. The product that we write, and a lot of my competitors out there as well, have got a big flexible system that actually could handle furlough already. We just didn't know it yet. But if you configured it correctly, you actually didn't need to do we didn't have to release a software update for furlough, because we worked out a way that you could configure the software, configure certain elements of the payroll to work so that it would calculate the furlough for you, which is where you wonder whether some of those more immature products, or those ones that aren't aiming at that larger business, they're going to struggle, and they would need a software update. So for us, it wasn't a particularly challenging time in terms of having to get an update out, but we were all sitting around a table working out how can we use the existing software as it is to allow people to deal with furlough out of the box, and the answer was yes, we could in the end, without having to issue a software update. So that's why I don't remember that period particularly badly in terms of a payroll software. It was bad for many other reasons, but not for that. And gender pay gap, to go back to that, has settled down now. They've left it, and it is what it is now, and unless somebody's going to come along and change it. And an interesting one as well, I mentioned teachers' pensions earlier. That they've said to me that they don't expect payroll software developers to produce a 100% compliant file. They said you can't. The guidance is designed to allow some level of discretion and choice on the employer's part, which means that we can't then produce a 100% accurate file. And I think it's just important for people to maybe understand that in certain cases, the payroll software can't necessarily deliver 100% accuracy. And that's where you mentioned it earlier, that human oversight coming in and just making sure, just dotting those I's and making sure that everything looks right or feels right. And if it's not, giving them the ability to change it.
No, it's really, I find all of it really, really fascinating and really insightful. So thank you for sharing. Just out of interest, from your perspective, Jason, as you've stepped back a little bit now from leadership, if you like, when you're going through the acquisition and things like that, and now you focus much more back on development. What areas of payroll or HR tech or time and attendance, if you prefer, do you think are most ripe for innovation right now? I'm assuming that you're not necessarily going to jump in with the answer of AI, which is why I want to ask the question, because of your earlier response.
Yeah, certainly I wouldn't jump in with that answer now. I'd like to see what comes. I'm happy not to be an early adopter on that one. Do you
Yeah.
know what, Nick? For me, I think it's not necessarily about where those individual um, products or sectors can be improved. It's about, for me, it's about how those products can be integrated with the wider business. That seems to me now to be the biggest shift in the way people approach their payroll and HR and time and attendance data, is that it very much sits in the middle of an organization, and you've got all of these other systems that spring off some of that data. So whether it's a timesheet system that feeds off the time and attendance, whether it's you know um, things like your identity provider, your Active Directory feeding off your HR system, because that's the driver for people changes, whether it's your finance system being driven from your payroll data. So for me, it's more about how can you use the data and use that to integrate with other systems within the business, and that's always been the case, right? Everyone has always wanted their payroll data to feed into their accounting system and their finance
Yeah.
system. That's not new, but what is new is that they also now identify that data as being relevant in other parts of the business, and how can we help them with that? And obviously, other guests have talked about financial well-being, early wage access, and those sorts of things. Getting that data into those platforms to widen, what I call it, widening the scope of the product. So the payroll and the HR and the time and attendance do what they do, and they do it very well. How can we widen what those products can do by communicating with other systems, whether it's an in-house system that a customer already has, or whether it's a third-party commercial product, like one of the ones that will do early wage access, or credit checking, and things like that. So that's where I sort of see the big changes, and that's what interests me, and that's kind of our big focus at the moment.
There's a reason I really like that response, because I think you've almost described what I've been saying on a slightly different thread, which is what I see the world of the payroll professional doing. And it's the idea, okay, you're cross collaborating across systems and broadening what the systems can do. But I think now we're in a world of payroll where the future of payroll is actually about more cross collaboration as payroll professionals, working with HR more closely, with finance, with well-being, whatever that might be, to improve the employee experience, and actually broadening their opportunities to have a more of a strategic input into the organizational, the success of the organizations that they represent. And I don't think that we never used to have that in the past. As you said, like, systems have always kind of sought to do this, and payroll have always had the opportunity to do this, but now it's much more common that actually people are going, you know what, if we want to raise the profile of payroll here and you want to raise the profile of HR, we kind of need to work together, because we can support you with these data insights and gender pay gap analysis and that, and you can support us in different areas as well, and vice versa. So I think that collaborative idea, not just between systems in the way that you highlighted it, but also as an industry as a whole, I think is really interesting, and where the future is moving. I guess my last question on the trend piece, if you like, is you talked about what you're working on now, which is quite exciting, and how you're going to broaden that out. What do you think is the next big trend from a software perspective that companies perhaps should be preparing for? And again, I'm not trying to push you into the world of AI. That may or may not be the answer. It could be in data analytics. It could be back into that broadening piece. But is there something where you're trying to predict the future, because so we can get a little bit ahead? What would that future prediction from your side look like at the moment if you were to make it?
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned analytics, and obviously that's important to everyone. And I always find it interesting that there are two camps when it comes to data reporting. There's quite often, when you're sort of in a demo or a tender, it's all about the analytics piece. What can the management team, what can the board get out of that information? Whereas the people who are running the payroll day to day often get left out of that conversation. But that's not what they need. They don't need that high level. They need that lower level payroll data instantly. Those employee listings, Power BI, based on last night's data, isn't enough. They want boots on the ground data. So the analytics piece is incredibly important, but not new. I think you sort of made that point. But it's an area that everybody is still sort of trying to get on top of. What's the best way to deliver it? Because everybody's got disparate systems. There isn't one perfect solution for providing that analytics data. Power BI is huge, but it's incredibly expensive and prohibitively expensive for a lot of clients. So what other options are there out there? So we and I know some of our competitors are constantly looking at how we could provide that level of analytics, but at an affordable price, because otherwise you can't provide it at all. So that's one area. The integration piece that we've talked about as well, and really I think just getting used to the fact that everything is sort of heading to the cloud, and again, that's not necessarily new or innovative, but since the working from home sort of being standardized, I work from home full time now, and having desktop software is just a thing of the past, and that's that was my bread and butter. That's what I was brought into Carval to do in the first place. The engine is all still there, like I said, but actually how you deliver that to the end user is changing, and that's different. And it's not just a case of rewriting the desktop product into a browser so that it can be delivered via the cloud, but it's also making sure that you leverage the best out of the browser. Think you do things differently. Just because that's how you did it on a Windows desktop application, you can do things a lot better, a lot more differently in a browser, and we should be exploiting that and making the most of that. So again, that's not innovative. I don't think that's massively forward thinking, but it's just something that everyone needs to be aware of, that I think that desktop software is fading away. And we've actually taken on a lot of clients from payroll providers who didn't want to make that jump to web and cloud, so they bowed out gracefully and let their clients go to market. And a lot of us will be picking up those clients. So it's just making sure that you're staying relevant, really, and knowing that those sorts of things are coming down the line, and being aware of them, and making sure that you're staying on top of them.
Well, last question, a bit of fun, really, before I open the vault, is if you could make one regulatory change just to make your life as a software developer an awful lot easier, and this change obviously impacts every software developer out there, what's the one regulatory change you would make to improve the payroll process potentially, or certainly just perhaps would you remove some of the complication, or you can choose? What would it be?
I think for me it would be data standardization. It's just the Wild West, especially in the public sector. I suspect many people listening to this will be familiar with local government pension scheme, and traditionally that was always up to the local authority to decide the data format. A few years ago, it was decided that they would all move to the iConnect format, which is great, fantastic. We've finally got a data standard. And the first thing that happened was every local authority then tweaked the iConnect format to suit them. Some of the fields don't hold for one local authority what they hold for another one, and overnight the data standard was lost. It was gone. You can produce, again, going back to what I said about teachers' pension, you can produce a 95% accurate file, but then you've got to handle what that local authority wants differently to its neighboring one, for example. So it's data standardization, and the same is true across the pension. We almost had it, and that's just in that one sector. The pension industry, is another one. I'm sure everyone's familiar with having to produce pension extract files to send to their providers, and they're all in a different format, often different formats for the same pension provider for a different pension scheme. And it's been tried before. There was an attempt to come up with a data standard for pension data extracts, but it sort of never really took off. And that's the sort of thing that it doesn't only make our life more difficult, it makes the payroller's life more difficult, because now they've got to produce multiple files, make sure it's in the right format, upload it to the right provider, and there are solutions on the market to help with that, to try and streamline that for you, but they don't cover all of the pension providers. So that's the one thing I would change, is please can we have some sort of standard.
I suspect there'll be listeners out there going, yeah, that's me. Wish agreeing with you, and I've done that file and this file, and I've seen the changes. So no, it's interesting, and always like to finish with a bit of information where the listeners can go, yeah, I completely get that, and that's nice.
We're all suffering together.
All suffering together. Absolutely right. So let's open the vault then. 3 short, sharp questions for you for a bit of fun. The first is this: drawing from your extensive career, what's one piece of timeless advice you would offer to payroll professionals today?
I think I would say you can't underestimate how important it is to check the information. We, as well as providing payroll to softwares, we run a bureau for clients as well. And it's just incredibly important that everything is checked, and you can't just assume that the software is going to get it 100% right. I hope I've opened eyes a little bit to understand that, it's just as challenging for us to write the product as it is for payrollers to run the payroll. So, just take that extra time to check the information.
Yeah, and absolutely right as well. I mentioned earlier about the ramifications of getting a payslip wrong. You don't want to be front page news. You don't want to lose your top talent. So yeah, it's worth running that extra check if you get the opportunity to do so. Question number 2, looking ahead, what do you envision will define the future of payroll?
I suspect we're going to be very much led by sort of what employees are expecting from employers. So like I've mentioned it, you've had speakers on it before about financial well-being and things like that. I think those sorts of things will drive what employees are looking for in a business, and therefore it's incumbent on systems like ours to make sure that we can provide that. And that's talking again about that widening the product and those integration pieces. I think it's very much that. I don't see there being necessarily huge legislative or compliance changes coming. Obviously, they'll drip through like they do every year, but in terms, I think it's led these days. Employees have a lot of power, quite rightly, potentially, about what they expect from their employer. And and it's up to systems like ours, HR as well, not just payroll, to make sure that they're allowing the employers to provide that to their employees.
Couldn't agree more. We saw it with the Great Resignation. The employee experience is where it's at now. And you know what? This is really good news, I think, for the world of payroll. This is allowing the payroll profession to get involved and to broaden their roles, to go back to what we were talking about earlier. So for me, it's an exciting shift. But yeah, I absolutely agree with that point. Last but not least, a little bit of fun for you here. If the payroll industry was a book, a song, or a film, you can choose. What book, song, or film would it be, and why?
So yeah, I'd heard you ask this question to some of your previous guests, and I was thinking there was some low-hanging fruit there, like Money, Money, Money with ABBA, or The Color of Money with Paul Newman. But actually, what I kind of settled on was The Matrix, because when you're first starting out, it's just an incomprehensible mass of numbers and legislation and guidance. And once you actually see through it, it becomes clear and it makes sense. And I think once you get to that point where it makes sense and you understand why things are done the way they're done, it's almost like that moment where Neo could see the Matrix, and that was kind of where I
love that. I know one of my favorite responses so far, and spoken like a true software developer at heart, right? The numbers coming together and the code and everything else. There's a lot of links in there. Jason, been an absolute pleasure having you today on the Payroll Podcast. I will put if it's okay with your permission, your LinkedIn profile into the show notes, so if people want to connect, find out more. Please do so. Jason's got lots of great content, 25-year track record in this space, so please do check out his details. That link will be in the show notes. Also, thank you ever so much for sharing all of your valuable insights and your experience. It's really clear just how much expertise you've got in this space. It's really important that payroll professionals understand the connection, the close connection between a proven track record, software development and provider in the space, and how that can impact a successful payroll process. So thank you ever so much for bringing some really interesting insights to today's show. And of course, if you are a payroll leader listening to this show and you need support either recruiting payroll software developers or salespeople or implementation people, if you're going through a software change, or indeed if you need someone to manage the payroll process, that's where we come in. Please do contact our business at jgarecruitment.com. We've also got a really long track record in this space as well. I've been doing this for over 20 years. JJ's been going since 2008. So lots of expertise in our business. If you do need support recruiting top talent, please do get in touch. Just need to say one huge final thank you to Jason for joining me today on the Payroll Podcast. I look forward to bringing you the next episode real soon. I'm your host, Nick Day, CEO at JJ Recruitment. Jason, thank you. This episode is sponsored by Deel. That's Deel. Deel is your forever people platform built to simplify your entire global payroll process. Deel's fully managed global payroll makes it possible to pay your entire team in over 100 countries and over 200 currencies, all in one place. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, Deel is built to meet your unique business needs. Ready to transform your global payroll system? If you are, click the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deel today. That's Deel.